What if faith has never meant trying to force yourself to believe harder, never meant pretending, never meant straining your mind against doubt, but has always meant something quieter, deeper, and far more dangerous to the surface, self-loyalty to an unseen reality that already exists before the world gives you permission to trust it? Because that is where most people fail without ever understanding why. They think faith is a mood, a burst of inspiration, a spiritual emotion, a moment of confidence, when in truth faith is fidelity, inward fidelity to what has not yet appeared. And that kind of loyalty cannot happen unless something in you has fallen in love with the reality you have not yet seen. A man cannot commit himself to what he does not love. He may talk about it, admire it, argue for it, defend it, even preach it, but he cannot inwardly yield to it unless his heart is moved by it. And this is why every false idea of God fails sooner or later, because if your idea of God does not awaken love in you, if it does not call forth trust, surrender, intimacy, tenderness, if it does not make you feel that you could yield to it completely, then it is not yet the true idea. For the deepest truth is not merely that God is powerful, though he is, not merely that God is wise, though he is, but that God is love, and love is the only thing to which the soul can finally abandon itself without violence. So again, quietly, what are you really yielding to when you imagine? Are you still trying to control everything from the surface? Or are you willing to perform the act and then surrender it to the depth within you that knows how to bring it to pass? Because that is the real secret. Not endless effort, not managing every detail, not outlining every step, but act, then yield. Assume, then surrender. Enter the fulfilled state, then rest in the confidence that the deeper being within you has seen it, heard it, accepted it, and will externalize it in ways your surface mind cannot possibly design. This is why the one who really understands the law does not ask, how will it happen? Because that question belongs to the level that cannot know. The higher ways are not the ways of the surface mind. The arrangements, coincidences, compulsions, meetings, delays, turns, and hidden sequences through which the fulfillment comes are all beyond the little planning faculty that calls itself practical. Your part is not to engineer the bridge. Your part is to dare to assume that the thing is already done and then fall asleep in that assumption as one who has entrusted the seed to the ground. This is faith. Not excitement, not drama, not pressure. Faith is self-abandonment to unseen reality. It is the inward act of saying, I have done what imagination asked of me. I have entered the end. I have thanked the depth of my own being. Now let it work. And the reason this feels so difficult to the surface self is that it wants to remain in charge even after imagining. It wants to inspect, calculate, interfere, supervise, doubt, revise, and ask again tomorrow if the thing is really on its way. But that is not faith, that is fear, trying to wear spiritual language. Faith acts and then yields. Faith knows that all things already exist and that the unseen is not made real by your believing in it. It was real before you believed. Your loyalty does not create eternal reality. It aligns you with it. It allows what is already real in the unseen to become meaningful in your experience. So if you want something in this world, something noble, something needed, something lovely, something even very human and practical in the world of Caesar, more money, a better place, meaningful work, relief from burden, healing, recognition, a greater opening, a transformed condition. There's nothing wrong with that. The desire itself rose from depths deeper than your little reasoning surface. The one who gave the urge can execute it. All that is asked of you is faith, not theological faith in the abstract, but living faith in the God within, the one you call I am, the one you cannot see as you see objects, because that being is the reality causing the objects. You do not see imagination as an object in space. You see its fruits. You see the world it has cast. You see the shadows of its activity. but the source itself remains invisible until one day, through a much deeper awakening, you know it directly. Until then, you are asked to trust it, to commune with yourself upon your bed, to enter the feeling of the wish fulfilled, to construct an imaginal act that implies the desire is done, to hear the friend tell you what you wanted to hear, to see the world as it would look if the thing were already true, to thank the unseen source, and then to surrender, not weakly, not passively, but as one who knows that the true worker is deeper than thought. This is why faith is so rare. Most men want visible proof before inward loyalty. They want outer permission before inner surrender. They want a sign before they commit. But there are moments when the soul becomes hungry enough, hungry not for bread, not for water, not for another explanation, but for the hearing of the word of God, for a real sign of favor, for a true taste of what is deeper than the world. And when that hunger awakens, the lesser concerns begin to lose some of their tyranny. Something in you starts to value the unseen more than surface safety. You begin to ask for a sign, not from superstition, but from hunger. And the sign comes, perhaps not in the full form yet, but as adumbration, as foreshadowing, as a whisper from the deeper order saying, yes, you are being heard. Yes, the world within is real. Yes, what has been promised is already seeded. And that changes a person. Because once you begin to receive even the faintest sign that the unseen is actual, your whole relationship to faith changes. Faith is no longer a religious obligation. It becomes the most practical thing in the world. It becomes the way you live between assumption and fulfillment. It becomes the bridge between the surface self and the deeper being who can do what you cannot. It becomes your refusal to turn back to appearances after you have once entered the end. And once that happens, once you begin to understand faith as loyalty to unseen reality, as abandonment of surface control to the love and power within, the whole practice becomes simpler, more intimate, and far more alive. You stop begging, you stop straining, you stop trying to force proof. You imagine, you yield, you trust, and you let the unseen become seen in its own appointed way. And once you begin to understand faith as loyalty to unseen reality rather than emotional effort, something else becomes clear with almost painful beauty. And it is this: the imaginal act by itself is not enough unless you are willing to let it descend beneath the surface mind into that deeper region where surrender takes place. Because the surface mind always wants to interfere, always wants to ask how, always wants to know when, always wants to feel in control. And that is exactly why so many desires never ripen into fact, even after they have been imagined. The act is performed, yes, but it is not entrusted. The seed is planted, but then it is dug up repeatedly by anxiety, inspection, and argument. So again, quietly, after you imagine, do you really yield? Or do you keep returning inwardly to the state of management? Because management is not faith. Management is fear, trying to supervise God. It is the surface self refusing to release the thing into the depth from which all real externalization comes. And yet the law is mercifully simple. You formulate an act that implies fulfillment. You inwardly hear the good news. You see what the world would look like were the desire already realized. You perform that act in imagination until it feels vivid enough to be a living inward event. And then you do something the surface self hates. You let go. Not by forgetting in the careless sense, not by becoming indifferent, but by surrendering authorship of the means. You stop asking the little mind to solve what belongs to a deeper wisdom. You stop insisting that the path conform to your logic. You stop requiring visible evidence before inward rest. You abandon yourself to the one within who knows ways and means a surface man cannot know. This is what Scripture means when it says that God's ways are higher. It does not mean you are cut off from Him. It means the level from which fulfillment comes is deeper than the level from which worry arises. It means your task is not to invent the bridge, but to dwell in the end and trust that the bridge will appear beneath your feet. And that trust is not an abstraction. It is practiced. It is embodied every time you go to sleep in the assumption that the thing is done. Sleep itself becomes sacramental here, because to fall asleep while identified with the fulfilled desire is to hand the imaginal act to the deeper self in its most receptive hour. You no longer remain the conscious manipulator of the scene. You become the yielded vessel. And yielding is the difficult part for the ego, because the ego wants to remain central. It wants to say, I imagine, therefore I must now monitor, protect, calculate, and make sure. But the deeper law says no. Imagine, then yield. Assume, then trust. Give thanks inwardly, then let the unseen do its appointed work. This is why no one can please God without faith. Not because God is insecure and needs your belief, but because without inward surrender, you are still living only on the surface, where no true externalization begins. The deeper being within you responds to abandonment, not to nervous surface control. The act of self-commission must become an act of self-surrender. That sounds paradoxical until it is lived. You commission the act by imagining. You surrender the act by faith. And only when both are present does the world begin to rearrange itself in that strange, hidden, often uncanny way that later seems perfectly natural when it finally breaks the surface. This is also why love matters so deeply. A man cannot really entrust himself to what he inwardly fears or resists. He may obey it out of duty, but he cannot surrender to it. And surrender is the very substance of faith. So if your idea of God is cold, distant, mechanical, punitive, impersonal, you will never truly abandon yourself into his hands, because there is no love there to call forth trust. But if God is known, even dimly at first, as the presence of infinite love within you, then something in you can finally rest. That resting is not passivity. It is confidence in being held by the creative source itself. It is the feeling that after the inward act has been performed, there is no need to strain further, because the one to whom you have yielded is faithful, powerful, intimate, and real. That is why the soul that hungers for an experience of God often finds that this hunger supersedes all other concerns. Once that hunger is awakened, money, reputation, even certain natural obligations begin to lose their old tyranny, because the soul wants something deeper than arrangement. It wants contact. It wants confirmation that the unseen source is real. And when even a sign comes, a dream, a foreshadowing, a symbolic unveiling, something shifts forever. The person may still be confused about timing, still uncertain about sequence, still not fully awake to the total mystery, but he knows now that the depth has answered. And once the depth has answered, faith becomes easier, not because all doubt vanishes, but because reality has become more intimate than theory. So the question sharpens again. What would change in your imaginal life if you truly believed that the depth within you had heard, received, and accepted your act the moment you performed it? You would stop begging. You would stop checking. You would stop returning every hour to see whether it was working. You would cease trying to force the unseen with surface effort. You would become calmer, more faithful, more inwardly exact. You would realize that your part is not endless repetition born of fear, but vivid assumption followed by genuine surrender. And from there the law begins to breathe. From there the bridge begins. From there compulsion rises. You wake under inward direction. You meet the right person without knowing why. You make a call you did not previously intend. You encounter the sequence that leads naturally to the end you imagined. And because you yielded, the unfolding comes from a deeper order than your planning could ever have achieved. That is the mystery and the mercy of faith. It does not make the unseen real. It makes you loyal to it until it clothes itself in fact. And when you begin to live this way, When the imaginal act is no longer something you merely perform, but something you entrust to the depth within you, you slowly discover that faith is not passive waiting at all, but participation in a hidden process already set in motion the moment you assume the end. This is where many still become confused, because after the act they expect lightning, spectacle, some immediate dramatic sign in the world of shadows, and when none appears at once, they imagine that nothing has happened. But the deepest things never begin on the surface. They begin in silence. They begin in that invisible region where meaning precedes event, where assumption precedes form, where your inward act becomes a command to the world long before the world outwardly shows obedience. So again, quietly, what if the moment you truly yielded, the fulfillment had already begun, even though your senses could not yet report it? Because that is what faith really asks you to accept, not that something might happen, but that something has been inwardly set in motion and is now moving toward embodiment through ways your little service mind cannot predict. This is why the state of surrender is so important. It stops you from interfering with the very thing you asked for. It stops you from going back to dig up the seed every morning to see whether it has roots. It stops you from turning the bridge into a battlefield of doubt. Once you yield, the work continues at another level, and often you rise under compulsion, not under logic. You will do things you did not plan. You will meet those you did not seek. You will move through a series of events whose meaning may not be visible until later. And only when the desire stands embodied before you will you look back and realize that the whole sequence was already contained in the act of surrender. This is why so many people miss the law even when they hear it. They want visible proof before inner loyalty. They want the bridge explained before they're willing to cross it. They want to know the mechanism before they will trust the maker. But the one who goes deeper begins to understand that the surface mind is not qualified to supervise the higher ways. It can accept or reject. It can imagine or refuse to imagine. It can yield or continue to grasp. But it cannot engineer the unfolding from its own small level. The higher ways truly are higher, not in the sense of distance, but in depth. And when you let that depth act, life begins to display a strange intelligence, an order that appears accidental from the outside and inevitable from the inside. This is why genuine signs can come not because they are needed for the law to work, but because the hunger of the soul sometimes calls forth a mercy, a foreshadowing, a whisper from the unseen that says, yes, you are heard. Yes, this inner world is real. Yes, the thing is already alive. Such signs may not yet be the full event. They may not yet be the complete unveiling, but they strengthen the heart. They teach you that the unseen is not empty. They train you to trust the deeper reality more than appearances. And that trust is everything, because without it, the mind returns too quickly to the surface and starts worshiping facts again. This is why the soul's hunger matters. The greatest hunger is not for bread, not for water, not even for relief from all worldly burdens, but for the hearing of the Word of God, for the inward recognition that the one who imagines, the one who yields, the one who says, I am, is not abandoned in a mechanical universe, but is actually one with the creative center of all things. Once that hunger awakens, ordinary explanations lose some of their force. Even worldly obligations, pressing as they are, cannot satisfy it. You want a sign, not of superstition, but of favor. You want to know that the unseen reality is actual. And when it answers, even in foreshadowing, you begin to understand that the whole of faith is relational. You are not merely throwing thoughts into an empty void. You are communing with the depth of your own being. You are addressing the one within who knows, sees, loves, and executes. That is why faith cannot be mechanical. It is rooted in love. It is rooted in trust. It is rooted in the willingness to abandon yourself into the keeping of the invisible presence within. The one who does this no longer feels that prayer is begging and external power. Prayer becomes intimate cooperation. Imagination becomes the chosen act. Surrender becomes the release. And life becomes the field in which the response appears. Then you start to see why, without faith, it is impossible to please Him. Not because God withholds out of pride, but because without inward surrender, you are never really turning to Him at all. You are still clinging to yourself on the surface. You are still asking the lesser level to produce what only the deeper level can externalize. And therefore you remain divided. But faith unifies. It joins the act and the source. It joins the wish fulfilled and the love that carries it to birth. It joins the surface self and the hidden being beneath it. That is why a true imaginal act performed in surrender has a density, a peace, a finality that surface wishing never has. You know something has happened. You may not be able to show it yet, but you know. And that knowing is the beginning of experience. Not complete yet perhaps, but already far beyond mere belief. So the question sharpens now. After you imagine, can you rest as one who has been heard? Can you move through tomorrow under the quiet conviction that the depth within you has accepted the act and is now externalizing it through channels beyond your sight? Because if you can, then faith has begun to become flesh in you. And once faith begins to take flesh, the world of unseen reality starts moving toward visible fact with the strange certainty of something that was always meant to be. And when faith begins to take flesh in you, when you no longer treat the imaginal act as a hopeful experiment but as an inward event already heard by the depth of your own being, then another great reversal begins. And this reversal is the end of your obsession with means. Because you finally understand that the moment you assume the end and yield to it, the path to that end is no longer your burden to invent. This is where the surface mind struggles most, because it wants to know the sequence. It wants to inspect the machinery. It wants to foresee the people, the timing, the calls, the meetings, the accidents, the doors, the detours, and all the strange movements through which the thing will arrive. But the very urge to outline the means reveals that the deeper act of surrender has not yet fully occurred. Because if you truly believed you had been heard, if you truly believed the depth within you had accepted your act, then the question how would lose much of its tyranny. So again, quietly, after you imagine, do you still keep trying to help God do what only God can do? Because that is what most anxiety really is. It is the little self trying to remain useful in a realm where its usefulness has ended. You have already done your part when you entered the end, felt the reality of fulfillment, and gave thanks inwardly. What remains is trust, not idleness, not negligence, not refusal of all movement, but trust that the movements which now arise will arise under a deeper compulsion than reasoning can generate. This is why one often wakes the next day and finds oneself doing, calling, moving, noticing, choosing, or meeting under an impulse one had not consciously arranged. The deeper being is now active. The bridge is now forming. And because the bridge belongs to a wisdom higher than surface calculation, it often appears strange only in retrospect. At the time, it may look ordinary. You simply go here, speak there, delay this, choose that, stumble upon another thing, and only later do you see that all of it was quietly converging upon the fulfilled assumption. This is why the wise imaginer does not worship logic after the act. He does not deny logic in the practical sense, but he no longer grants it sovereignty. He knows that the path of fulfillment can move through channels the surface mind would never have selected, and that what appears impossible at one level may be entirely natural at another. The phrase, "your ways are not my ways," becomes experiential here, not merely scriptural. It means that the unfolding belongs to a dimension of intelligence that sees more than the waking mind sees. And because of that, surrender is not weakness, it is alignment. It is the recognition that your part is to occupy the state, not to micromanage its embodiment. This is also why thanksgiving is so powerful. To give thanks before the fact is visible is to place yourself psychologically beyond the stage of petition. It is to announce inwardly that the thing is done. One does not thank for what is not yet inwardly accepted. One thanks because inwardly it is accepted. And that gesture of gratitude seals the act. It quiets the mind. It softens the urge to interfere. It confirms the fulfilled state. It is one of the purest forms of faith because it assumes reception before evidence. The man who gives thanks after fulfillment is ordinary. The one who gives thanks before fulfillment is living from the law. That is why the old mind rebels. It says, how can I thank for what I do not yet see? But the answer is simple, because the imaginal act, once accepted, is already real in the only place where creation begins. The seen will catch up. The unseen is first. And once you begin to live from that order, a great peace starts entering your relationship to desire. You no longer feel that every wish is a burden to carry personally all the way into fact. You realize that your role is far more intimate and far less exhausting than that. You choose the end. You enter it. You feel it. You yield to it. You give thanks. Then you allow the deeper being within you to move the whole outer apparatus toward that appointed end. This is where life becomes less frantic and far more magical, though not in the sentimental sense. Magical because response becomes visible. Magical because the world begins to reveal itself as infinitely more porous to consciousness than you were trained to believe. Magical because doors open where none seem to exist, and arrangements form with a kind of hidden accuracy that no planning could equal. Yet all of this happens under a law so exact that it ceases to be fantasy and becomes simply another order of causation. So the question sharpens again. Can you remain faithful to the end without becoming a servant of the means? Can you let the fulfilled desire be enough inwardly without insisting on previewing the mechanism by which it must appear? Because that is one of the surest signs that faith has matured. The one whose faith is still shallow keeps asking how. The one whose faith is deepening begins to care more about fidelity than sequence. He knows the sequence belongs to the one within. He knows his task is to remain inwardly true. And that is why sleep becomes holy, gratitude becomes intelligent, and surrender becomes powerful. You are no longer living by surface panic. You are living by unseen certainty. And once unseen certainty takes root deeply enough, the bridge of incidents begins to feel less like fate and more like the natural body of faith itself. And when unseen certainty begins to feel more natural to you than surface panic, you start to understand why the whole movement of faith is not toward passivity, but toward a deeper kind of activity. One that does not strain on the surface and yet accomplishes more than all anxious effort ever could, because what is happening now is that you are learning to let the depth of your own being do what the surface man was never meant to do. This is the great relief hidden inside the law. You do not have to carry the burden all the way from desire to fulfillment by sheer personal force. You are not asked to twist life into shape with worry, not asked to manipulate every circumstance, not asked to supervise every step of the bridge. You are asked to assume, to yield, and to remain loyal. That sounds almost too simple until you realize how much of the old self must die for it to become natural. The old self wants to keep laboring even after the seed is planted. It wants to check whether the ground is working. It wants to ask whether the unseen is really unseen, or whether perhaps nothing has happened at all. It wants to look at tomorrow's facts and make them judge today's faith. But again, quietly, if the act was truly accepted, what remains for the surface self to do except betray it or remain loyal to it? Because that is the real choice after imagination. Not whether the world is ready yet, but whether you will continue in faith or return to visible evidence for emotional permission. This is why the deepest practice is often invisible to others. Outwardly, you may appear to do very little. Inwardly, everything has changed. You have stopped arguing with the delay. You have stopped asking for immediate explanation. You have stopped calling the unseen unreal merely because it has not yet become public. You have begun to let the fulfilled state hold you. And when that happens, the whole emotional atmosphere of life shifts. Desire becomes less feverish, less pleading, less restless. It begins to feel dignified. It begins to feel like something already welcomed in consciousness. No longer a beggar at the door, but a guest received within the house. This is where thanksgiving becomes not a technique, but a natural response. You do not thank as one trying to flatter God into action. You thank because the act is inwardly done. Gratitude is the emotional seal of acceptance. It says, without strain, I have received. And once that feeling becomes real, the soul begins to rest in a way the surface mind calls unreasonable, but the deeper self recognizes as faith. This is also why the stories that seem so impossible from the outside are actually so exact from within. A sign of favor comes to one who asks with hunger. A foreshadowing appears before the full unveiling. A condition changes without strain when the right inner act has been performed. A simple request answered from the chair, from the bed, from silence, from inward hearing, without money, without force, without spectacle. And the reason these things seem extraordinary is only because man has been taught to trust the visible more than the real. But once you begin to live from faith, the invisible order starts to feel more trustworthy than the world of appearances, because you see again and again that the invisible is causative. It is not fantasy. It is not nothing. It is the womb of fact. So the question sharpens now. After you have imagined and yielded, are you still treating the visible world as judge, or are you allowing it to become witness? Because it must become witness if faith is to deepen. The world cannot be allowed to vote on the truth of what has already been inwardly accepted. It may lag, it may contradict, it may mock, it may look unchanged, but it does not get to decide. It only gets to catch up. That is why loyalty matters more than intensity. Some imagine with great heat for one night and abandon the state the next morning. Others imagine quietly, sincerely, and then remain inwardly faithful through the interval. It is the latter who begin to see the law mature in them, because the law does not require theatrical emotion. It requires reality of acceptance. It requires fidelity. It requires that you stop using imagination as a temporary escape and start honoring it as the causal center of your life. Then even your ordinary movements begin to change. You do not move with the same desperation. You do not talk with the same fear. You do not react with the same helplessness. Something in you has begun to trust the invisible working of the deeper self. And that trust becomes strength, not loud strength, not egoic strength, but the quiet strength of one who no longer needs to see the whole path in order to believe the destination is sure. This is where the whole message on faith becomes deeply practical. Faith is not merely a religious word. Faith is the art of living from what imagination has accepted rather than from what the senses are temporarily reporting. Faith is loyalty to the unseen reality until the unseen reality becomes seen. Faith is the refusal to disturb the seed by panic. Faith is the inner abandonment of self to the one within who can execute what you cannot. Faith is the confidence to fall asleep in the assumption and let the deeper wisdom take over. And when that becomes your way of living, not once, not occasionally, but as a habit of consciousness, you begin to discover that the world is far more obedient than you thought, and that what once seemed impossible was only impossible to the surface man who would not yet surrender. And when you begin to live as one who has surrendered the seed to the depth within, instead of trying to force the harvest with surface anxiety, you come upon another realization that changes everything again. And this realization is that the real obstacle was never the world. Never circumstances, never time, never other people, but your own refusal to believe that the invisible is the only true source of the visible. That is what must break if faith is to become creative rather than ceremonial. So again, quietly, what are you still granting more authority, your imaginal act or the evidence of your senses? Because whichever one you secretly trust more is the one you are serving. And service to appearances will always return you to the same prison, no matter how beautifully you speak about faith. This is why the whole law insists on reversal. Not reversal as a trick, but reversal as a new order of reality. You must learn to treat the unseen as cause and the seen as result. You must stop believing that matter, circumstances, headlines, opinions, institutions, delays, and so-called facts are initiating your life, and begin to see them as the outpicturing of what has already been accepted within consciousness. Until that inward reversal happens, you may admire the law, quote the law, even attempt the law, but you will still live in bondage to the surface. And bondage to the surface is what makes faith feel fragile. Yet when the reversal begins to take hold, even slightly, a strange authority enters your being. Not authority over others in some worldly sense, but authority over your own reactions, over the meaning you assign to appearances, over the right of facts to name you. The world may still look the same for a while, but inwardly something has already shifted. You stop asking appearances for permission. You stop waiting for visible evidence before you dare to identify with the fulfilled desire. You begin to see that the whole visible realm is always late. It is always reporting yesterday's inward life. It is always showing the echo of what was believed before. And this is why the faithful imaginer must learn not to be hypnotized by current conditions. Current conditions are not prophecy. They are residue. They are not destiny. They are an after image. And the moment you really grasp that, you stop treating them with the same reverence. You may still have to move through them, yes, but you no longer bow before them. You no longer let them define what is possible. This is where man begins to discover the actual power and wisdom of God within himself. Because the more deeply he trusts the imaginal act, the more he starts to live from a region beyond reason's tyranny. Reason still has its use on its own level, but it is not the creator. It is not the source. It cannot generate the new state. It can only analyze the old one. And this is why reason so often throws its little stones at faith. It says, look at the facts. Look at the delay. Look at the past. Look at what usually happens. Look at what they said. Look at what is lacking. Look at how impossible this is. But reason never asks the more dangerous question. What if the facts are only the shadow of previous assumptions and not the final truth? What if the visible world has no right to define the next movement of consciousness? What if the thing that seems impossible from the level of the surface is already perfectly possible in the depth that actually creates? Once those questions begin to live in you, the old bondage starts to crack. You do not become irrational. You become hierarchical. You put things in their proper order. The unseen first, the seen second, faith first, evidence second, assumption first, appearance second, meaning first, form second. And that ordering is the beginning of freedom. Because once the order is right, the law can actually operate through you. Before that, you keep choking it with constant return to the senses. This is why scriptural faith is never merely agreement with statements. It is alignment with reality at its causal level. It is love strong enough to yield, trust deep enough to abandon service control, and loyalty firm enough to remain true to what the inner act has already accepted. Then the world begins to show you signs, not because signs are the source, but because the source is already active. A foreshadowing comes, a dream returns, a symbolic event arrives, a small request is fulfilled, a condition shifts, a response comes from nowhere, a hidden sequence begins to gather itself. And each of these becomes an invitation to go deeper still, not into superstition, but into confidence. Not into dependence on signs, but into recognition that the unseen order is real. This is also why the faith of a child can sometimes seem greater than that of an adult. The child has not yet fully learned to worship the surface. The child may still believe the inward act has power. The adult has been trained out of that innocence and into a kind of fact-based slavery, calling it maturity. But what the world calls maturity is often only estrangement from the source. The real maturation of the soul is not away from imaginative trust, but into its wiser, deeper, more deliberate use. You do not become childish again in ignorance. You become childlike in confidence, while mature in understanding. And that combination is extraordinarily powerful, because then you can use imagination without apology and surrender without fear. So the question sharpens now. If the invisible is truly the source, are you ready to stop living as though the visible were Lord? Are you ready to let faith become more than a comforting word and allow it to reorder your whole way of interpreting life? Because once you do, once the reversal is inwardly established, the world begins to change character before it changes form. It becomes less like a tyrant and more like a mirror, less like a prison and more like a witness, less like a cause and more like an echo. And then you begin to see why faith is not merely helpful. It is the very way by which the invisible becomes flesh. And when the world stops feeling like a tyrant and begins to reveal itself as witness, as mirror, as echo, another transformation quietly takes place within you. And this transformation is perhaps the most important of all. Because now faith is no longer something you do only in special moments, but something you begin to live from as the atmosphere of your being. It ceases to be an occasional spiritual exercise and becomes a way of seeing, a way of hearing, a way of relating to yourself, to others, and to every event that rises in your world. So again, quietly, what kind of inner world are you now prepared to remain loyal to? Not for a few minutes in meditation, not only on your bed at night, but throughout the whole movement of your days. Because that is where the portrait of the new self is finally painted. Not in one grand act alone, though the grand acts matter, but in the steady refusal to betray the unseen reality after you have once accepted it. And that refusal changes everything. It changes the way you respond to delay. It changes the way you hear criticism. It changes the way you interpret contradiction. It changes the way you move through the facts of life. You no longer let every visible circumstance vote on the truth of your imaginal act. You no longer grant every opposing voice the right to rename you. You no longer let reason drag you back to the surface each time the bridge passes through an interval of obscurity. Instead, you become inwardly faithful in a way that slowly remakes your whole nature. This is why faith is so much more than belief in the ordinary sense. Belief can still waver. Belief can still be a statement. Belief can still remain partly theoretical. But faith lived as loyalty becomes identity. It becomes the way you inwardly dwell. It becomes the ground from which you speak, listen, assume, and respond. And when that happens, the fulfilled desire stops feeling like something you are trying to hold on to and begins to feel like the place from which you are now living. That is the great shift from effort into embodiment. The one who has not yet reached it still says, I am trying to believe. The one who is entering it says nothing so strained. He simply begins to act inwardly as though the unseen reality were already the basis of his world, because for him it is. This is why sleep, inward conversation, thanksgiving, and surrender all deepen over time. They stop being techniques and become natural movements of a life increasingly rooted in the source. The person who once pleaded now gives thanks. The one who once checked now rests. The one who once begged now communes. The one who once feared delay now understands gestation. The one who once looked outside for confirmation now turns within for reality. And none of this happens by accident. It happens because the law, once proven even slightly, begins to train the soul into a new mode of existence. You discover that imagination is not only how things are changed, but how the self is changed. Every imaginal act, rightly held, is re-educating your whole consciousness. It is teaching you what to trust. It is teaching you what the world is. It is teaching you where God actually is. It is teaching you who the operant power has always been. That is why this life of faith becomes at once humbling and empowering. Humbling because you realize how much of your previous suffering came from surface worship, from giving final authority to facts, from yielding your identity to appearances. Empowering because you realize that no appearance ever deserved that authority in the first place. The deeper being within you was always the source. The world was always response. And now that you know it, you cannot go back to unconscious living in quite the same way. You may still falter, yes. You may still forget for moments, yes. You may still feel the pull of old habits, yes. But something has already changed. You know too much now. You have seen that faith, understood rightly, is not blind optimism, not religious rhetoric, not emotional excitement, but fidelity to the invisible source from which all things come. And that knowledge begins to make you inwardly noble, not noble by social status, not noble by approval, not noble by performance, but noble in the deepest spiritual sense, because you are no longer living at the mercy of shadow. You have started to live from substance, and substance, once inwardly known, carries a different quality of being. It gives you patience without passivity, seriousness without heaviness, tenderness without weakness, confidence without arrogance. It makes you more merciful toward others because you begin to see how everyone is living from the degree of reality they can currently accept. Some still worship icons. Some still seek holy men outside themselves. Some still look for places, objects, relics, systems, diets, rituals, formulas, meditations on trivialities, and every manner of external aid, because they have not yet discovered that the real holy place is the depth of their own being. But once you begin to know that, even dimly, you cannot be wholly seduced by the outer again, you understand that the true temple is within, the true altar is imagination, the true act of worship is assumption followed by surrender, and the true proof is the externalization of what was inwardly accepted. This is why the mature life of faith becomes so simple. Not easy perhaps, but simple. You know what you want, either for yourself or another. You construct a scene that implies it is done. You enter that scene and feel its reality. You commune with yourself upon your bed. You give thanks. You yield completely. And then you remain loyal to the unseen reality until it hardens into fact. That is all. Yet in that all lies the transformation of life. In that all lies the discovery of Christ as power and wisdom in action. In that all lies the remaking of self and world together. And when one begins to live from that level, even imperfectly, one starts to feel the strange grandeur of it. That every day, every thought, every reaction, every inward conversation is no longer trivial, but part of the great movement by which the unseen becomes seen, by which the hidden God within man reveals himself through faith lived as fidelity. And when faith has become fidelity, when the unseen reality has become more authoritative to you than the evidence of your senses, when you no longer go to bed as one begging the world for permission, but as one communing with the depth of your own being, something final begins to reveal itself. And what reveals itself is not merely the power to change circumstances, though that power is real, but the identity of the one who has been changing them all along. This is the end toward which all the lesser demonstrations have been leading. Not simply more money, more success, more openings, more signs, more answered requests, though all these have their place and prove the law on this level. But the unveiling of the one who says, I am within you as the only operant power there is. So again, quietly, what if every fulfilled desire, every successful imaginal act, every sign of favor, every strange and beautiful bridge of incidents has been preparing you for one greater realization, that the God to whom you yielded was never other than your own deepest being? Because once that begins to dawn, the whole world changes meaning. Life is no longer merely a place where wishes are granted. It becomes the school in which the invisible dreamer within you awakens through the faithful use of imagination. Then every active assumption becomes more than a technique. It becomes participation in the eternal purpose. Every time you imagine lovingly for another, every time you refuse to worship facts, every time you remain loyal to the unseen reality after the imaginal act, every time you fall asleep in the conviction that it is done, you are not merely practicing a law of manifestation. You are cooperating with the awakening of God in man. And this is why the whole drama of Scripture can never be found outside. Why no relic, cloth, piece of wood, sacred place, holy man, system, ritual, or external symbol can ever finally satisfy the soul. The whole drama is within. The resurrection is within. Bethlehem is within. Zion is within. The Father is within. The Son is within. The whole movement from limitation to awakening is contained within the skull of man, within the hidden depths of consciousness, within the very one who now listens, imagines, assumes, doubts, believes, yields, and one day will awaken fully as the Lord himself. This is why all the confusion of the world cannot finally matter. Let men search archaeology for God. Let them bow before objects. Let them cling to systems. Let them mistake Scripture for secular history and wonder why it never becomes alive in them. You now know something deeper. You know that faith is not loyalty to symbols, but to unseen reality. You know that the unseen reality is not absent, but immediate. You know that imagination is not fantasy, but causation. You know that surrender is not passivity, but trust in the higher ways of the being within. You know that the whole visible world is only shadow, report, echo, and response. And once you know that, the center of your life quietly shifts forever. You stop going from teacher to teacher looking for what only the source can give. You stop asking others to intercede where you must yield directly. You stop trying to buy in retail what can only be known wholesale from the depth of your own I am. You stop being so impressed by outer noise, outer holiness, outer authority, outer credentials, outer systems, because you have begun to taste the directness of the thing itself. You know what it is to formulate a fulfilled act, to feel it, to surrender it, to remain faithful to it, and then to watch the world conspire, rearrange, echo, and finally embody what was accepted in silence. And because you know this, your relationship to desire changes too. You are no longer ashamed of wanting. You no longer confuse desire with weakness. You understand that the urge itself rises from depths deeper than the surface man, and that the one who planted the desire has the power to execute it. So you cease apologizing for noble wants. You cease diminishing yourself before the world of Caesar. You ask boldly, imagine clearly, surrender deeply, and trust patiently. Yet even these smaller fulfillments begin to point beyond themselves. They begin to train your faith for the ultimate unveiling. They begin to prepare you for the day when the whole drama of Scripture erupts in you, when the hidden fatherhood is known, when the Son appears, when the mystery ceases to be theory and becomes your own experience. Then you will know beyond all argument who Jesus is. Not as a figure outside, not as an external savior arriving from space, but as the man in whom the will of God is fulfilled, the man who awakens as the father of David, the man who discovers himself to be one with the source from which all creation flows. And that man is not someone else, it is the one in whom God awakes, It is you. This is why faith is so central. Without faith, you remain bound to the surface, where none of this can be understood. Without faith, you keep asking the visible to confirm the invisible before you will trust it. Without faith, you remain trapped in secondary causation, forever reacting, never creating. But with faith, faith as loyalty to unseen reality, faith as complete self-abandonment to the love and power within, faith as the refusal to betray the imaginal act after it is performed, faith as thanksgiving before evidence, faith as rest in the assumption fulfilled, the whole world begins to open. Circumstances change. Requests are answered. Signs appear. Compulsions rise. Bridges form. Desires embody themselves. And beyond all these, the deeper miracle advances. The invisible one within you is waking to himself through your faithful use of his power. So the final question is no longer, can this work? It is no longer, will he do it? It is no longer, how long will it take? The final question is this: are you willing to live from the unseen as though it were the only true reality until it becomes the seen? Because that is the whole of faith. That is the whole of the law. That is the whole of the message. Assume the end, perform the act, give thanks. Yield completely, remain loyal, let the world echo. Let the higher ways unfold. Let the seed ripen in its appointed hour. Let the visible obey the invisible. And in doing so, desire by desire, proof by proof, surrender by surrender, you will discover not only that faith works, not only that imaginal acts become facts, but that the one who has been faithful all along is the God within you, awakening through experience to the knowledge of himself.